Tonight's speaker is Molly Fitzgerald Perry, who is lecturer in history at Christopher Newport University. She is also a PhD candidate at the College of William and Mary. The title of her lecture tonight is The Lowest of the Mob, Exploring the Actions of Sailors and Slaves During the Stamp Act Crisis. Will you please welcome Molly Perry?
So I want to start tonight by discussing what was happening in Boston 250 years ago that really brings us together. So we'll go back to the streets to really think about what was happening in this place. Late September of 1765 into early October was a particularly tense time in colonial Boston, one in which a version of martial law kept an uneasy peace. In many ways, it was more of an armistice than a peace. August had brought about a series of mob disturbances. I believe if you've attended other of these lectures, they focused on those as well. And this was the time period when the first, what supporters of the anti-stamp cause would call patriotic sparks, were seen on the streets of Boston. Supporters of the movement thought that Boston was kind of this herald of something much larger. Now, for royal officials and the targets of this mob violence, this was the beginning stages of what they called a contagion, something that came to infect the other colonies in the area, which would spread, as we're going to see in this talk tonight, from Nova Scotia south into the West Indies into St. Kitts as well. But going back to focus on the streets of Boston, on October 14th, 1765, the city of Boston awoke to a scene of great protest in the most public part of town, where port residents discovered an effigy sustaining the very unpopular office of the stamp master hanging on a tree. It would have looked something like this. This is actually printed later, but it's telling you and informing you about what these effigy scenes might have appeared to be. The scene was calculated to convince Andrew Oliver, the stamp master, to resign his post. The display also provided a much wider political lesson of imperial politics to the spectators and residents of Boston who witnessed the scene. Alongside the stamp master's corpse hung a symbol which was borrowed directly from street protests that were happening in London at the time. It was a, quote, boot, wherein was contained the young imp of a devil. This was a not-so-subtle play on the name of one of the king's close ministers, Lord Bute, who was said to be overly influential on the young King George. This was the first of a very similar series of fantastical sights which filled the streets of colonial port towns from August of 1765 to May of 1766. And in many ways, what happened here in Boston set a pattern or a mold that would be followed and adopted and adapted elsewhere. To secure the repeal of the Stamp Act, which was the primary goal of these types of displays, colonial protesters staged theatrical spectacles in the street, which were designed to persuade audiences both local and imperial. Strategically, the goal of repeal was one that was best accomplished by working within the empire, by building a wide transatlantic coalition of fellow colonists, merchants, members of parliament, ministers, agents, and sympathetic Britons who would lobby for repeal. It was hoped that by building this coalition, you could demonstrate the impracticality of the taxation scheme, while also influencing the course of future reforms and revenue measures. In this way, local actions on the streets in Boston can be best understood through this imperial context. English perceptions mattered. The thoughts of what people conceived of these protests in London mattered to colonial and anti-stamp cause. So displaying a wide participation in the streets was key to portraying a unified colonial opinion. So to recruit a large audience, these street protests would regularly feature things like music, decorations, ringing of bells to draw people together, costumes, fireworks, resonant symbols that people could recognize, processions that went throughout the town, and even food and drink in large quantities. In Boston, that August 14th, for example, the multitude of spectators who continually assembled throughout the whole day for, as it was called, the diversion, observed an active street theater that was designed to engage onlookers. On that busy market day, and these types of protests were often designed for market or court days to get kind of the largest group of people from both the city and the country in to see them. People weren't just suffered to look at the effigy, they were asked to engage in it. That, quote, not a peasant was allowed to pass till he had stopped and got his goods stamped by the effigy. This didactic theater accomplished a critical goal of any protest movement, transforming onlookers or spectators into participants and into members of the scene. At the same time, these types of exceptional scenes of street theater also played before unintended audiences and unwelcome spectators who resided within colonial port cities, and in particular, free and enslaved African Americans, as well as the poorer sorts from the dockside community and itinerant jack-tar mariners. When colonists chose to engage in politics in the street, they also created opportunities for a wide spectrum of the community to participate in this political debate, and often unwelcome groups of people who they were unintended would take part in this. Tonight, I'm going to share with you a few of the case studies from my larger book project to illustrate how the surviving sources, both those colonial sources as well as the imperial ones from London as well as from colonial administrators and royal officials, describing protest, reveal the actions of these community members who are often left out of the historical record. And in many ways, this is sort of the goal of my research, is to try to recreate what these port cities really looked like and who were part of these port cities. The people who are often left out, to read into the silences, try to understand the actions of these groups. Slaves and sailors, even in a city like Boston, constituted a sizable and very visible population in these port towns. And so, in a way, this moment of crisis and community disruption allows us to see the actions of these groups in a way that is often missed. And that's what I'm looking to do tonight and looking to do in larger part with my scholarship and research. In particular, the actions of sailors and slaves and the debates over their participation indicates that there was a long-term struggle that was occurring over exactly who could claim membership as part of the body public. And this would be a struggle that would profoundly impact the coming of the revolution. From these very first moments of intense debate as subjects, long before debates over citizenship, but as subjects over the rights and privileges of British liberty, there's a struggle that's occurring within communities over precisely who will be included and excluded based on race and class. This debate would directly influence the shifting strategies of dissent over the course of the Stamp Act crisis, and informed the definitions of citizenship which began to emerge during the Revolution and early national periods. So over the course of the Stamp Act crisis, so from that August of 1765 into May of 1766, we can start seeing a shift in strategies of protest. From these first raucous street actions in Boston and these riots, into the rise of non-importation or boycott associations as a method to limit the participation and start to exclude individuals from claiming their rights to British liberty. Now back to the streets of Boston. The actions of these unintended audiences became quickly apparent as the motley crew began to rise in riots. And in fact, here we start to see the first kind of visual evidence or what the scene might have looked like in Boston. So I'm going to have you focus on the effigy that's displayed, that people are gathered around. The actions of the crowd in Boston provided the first sense that once unleashed, this kind of aggressive, boisterous style of English crowd action could quickly overwhelm the thin veneer of civic order in colonial towns. The nature of political theater shifted over the course of that August 14th. It went from afternoon into evening and then into subsequent nights as Boston's effigies became mobile parades accompanied by large crowds that threatened violence and destroyed property. By early September, the crowd action had become so violent, so uncontrollable, that Governor Bernard sensed that the protests were devolving into, quote, a war of plunder and general leveling. Bernard forecast that the day the act was to go into effect, November 1st, would be a day of great anarchy and confusion in Boston, and soon there would be an insurrection of the poor against the rich. Of particular concern for many in Boston was what would happen on November 5th. November 5th was a traditional day of disorder and a yearly Saturnalia, which was Pope's Day. Traditionally, and this is an image from a few years later, but it gives you a sense of what was happening in Boston on November 5th, this Guy Fawkes, or Pope's Day, had become a grand gala day celebrating anti-Stuart victory, a day of celebrating British patriotism. It was also a day known for its rituals of reversal. As historian Alfred Young would describe it, it was a day of comic mocking of authority, when the streets would fill with laboring people and rival gangs from the north and south ends of town would dress in costume and blackface. Yearly, the two companies of men would roll out large stages, such as the one pictured here, that were drawn by horses and would move through town featuring these large effigies of the Pope and often the Pretender. Accompanying the float, which you can also see in this image, were young boys who would be dressed in costumes, and they would beat drums, they blew horns and conch shells, and they would actually manipulate the effigies to work like puppets. When the two wagons meeting from the opposite sides of town met, they would then engage in this large brawl that took place. The victor would capture the loser's wagon and carry it off to be burned in a giant bonfire. In past year, Pope's Days had devolved into annual kind of organized street brawls where, quote, the servants and the blacks would disguise themselves and armed with clubs engage each other with great violence. Following the particularly notorious riot of 1764, the previous year, which led to the death of a young child beneath one of the wagon spokes and wheels, several of the leading figures of the mob were arrested and a grand jury issued indictments. We know from those sources that it includes a man said to be a leader of the mob who was a mixed-race servant, or described as a mixed-race servant. The news from Pope's Day, November 5th, 1765, however, brought a surprising break to this tradition of disorder. On that most notoriously violent public day, the whites of Boston peacefully drew together under a banner that read, "Lovely Unity." The choreographed day passed without incident. Two sets of this same pageantry representing the Pope now included an expanded set of characters and caricatures to protest the Stamp Act, including, quote, the effigies signifying tyranny, oppression, and slavery. The elaborate displays were, as traditionally done, carried from the city's north and south neighborhoods, and upon reaching one another, where they would traditionally engage each other in this grand battle, they instead greeted each other with 3 huzzas in a very ceremonial manner before proceeding to the Tree of Liberty. As a display of both British patriotism and protest, the street theater of Pope's Day impressed the newspaper reporter who gave us this source and this description. Searching for an explanation to explain what had happened, how this transformation had occurred, the author noted, quote, "To the honor of those concerned, even as spectators filled the streets, not a club was seen, nor, and I quote, was any black person allowed to approach near the stage." Controlling the local audience and spectators, in print, if not in reality, enabled this colonial booster, this person supporting the anti-stamp crowd, the anti-stamp cause, to broadcast a very clear message across the empire of the restrained nature of colonial protest, and to legitimize this crowd in the English tradition. Meanwhile, we have a separate set of sources that describe what happened on the ground as well, where they write that a gang of 100 or 150 men who were trained as regular as a military corps followed the command of the shoemaker Ebenezer Mackintosh. Governor Francis Bernard described these patrols intimidating royal forces and policing the spectacle with cudgels, which are, of course, the tools of sailors and dock workers. From these sets of surviving sources, we can begin, or at least try to start to retrace the invisible networks of communication that must have filled the streets of Boston and the dockside community. and start to think about how people in the black community would have responded to this as well. And start to think about the warnings that must have been broadcast about the violence that people sensed would meet them and would await anyone attempting to cross this color line and approach the stage. For Boston's African Americans, absence served as a very intelligent strategy to avoid a dangerous white crowd. At the same time, by actively excluding African American participants from this traditional day of power reversals and also statements of patriotism, colonial whites in Boston demonstrated a common cause and delineated precisely who they felt could claim these rights to British liberty. In accounts written to persuade imperial audiences, itinerant soldiers and African Americans often feature at the center of these types of descriptions of crowd action. Both these scenes of unruly mob attacks, as well as peaceful, symbolic street festivals like this one in Boston. Now, on one hand, we can use these sources to try to determine the choices and actions of individuals within the port communities, to try to get this rare glimpse of what's happening on the street, capturing a set of people who are often lost to the historical record. At the same time, Jack tar sailors and black slaves were political icons, and they resonated across the empire, and often resonated as kind of grotesque caricatures. So part of the challenge of reconstructing the actions of mariners and African Americans during this moment is that written sources regularly manipulated their presence and actions in order to serve a larger constitutional argument that they were going through. So we'll go a little bit further south to the area that's my main focus. In Charleston, South Carolina, the protesters in the anti-stamp procession quickly recognized the subversive possibilities for slave spectators at this moment of community disruption. As white crowds paraded through the streets shouting liberty and no stamp tax, a group of slaves began to shout back and shouted liberty as well. This join-in of their own rough music frightened many of the whites, as you can imagine. At the same time, the South Carolina Gazette, the newspaper in Charleston at the time, was closed due to the Stamp Act, and a large number of slaves took advantage of the suspension of the runaway advertisements and ran away, and took this as an opportunity to claim their own liberty. The rapid set of actions by free and enslaved African Americans frightened many whites, creating, according to a merchant, Henry Lawrence, a, quote, disturbance that gave vast trouble throughout the province, prompting patrols to ride night and day for 10 or 14 days, and residents in the town to become, quote, soldiers in arms. Lieutenant Governor William Bull Jr. requested funding for a massive manhunt to recapture these runaway slaves, warning the House of Assembly of a general insurrection of the slaves that could take place. To recapture the estimated 107 runaways, the Assembly voted to hire Catawba Indians to search the swamps and allotted 200 pounds sterling to be paid to the owner of any slave that was killed in the process of the search. To frighten whites, the choices and actions of these free and enslaved African Americans suddenly threatened to topple South Carolina's colonial order. Nearly a decade before Lord Dunmore issued his proclamation freeing loyal slaves, African Americans from this very first moment of imperial crisis in the port cities began to press upon the fissures within the white community, altering the course of the imperial crisis and informing some of the strategic decisions and tactical choices by both white colonists and royal officials. Unfortunately for us as historians, few of the surviving accounts of protest capture black agency as clearly as this Liberty incident does in Charleston, South Carolina. But the multiple accounts here shed some light on the possibilities that existed on the ground. What we start to see is that often, when they're advocating for their cause, white colonists and royal officials communicating with imperial audiences revealed that there was a racial discourse closely tied to these constitutional debates. For example, in Charleston's new newspaper, the South Carolina Gazetteer and County Journal, which was printed in defiance of the stamp tax, they chose to print and start this newspaper without the stamps to show as an act of protest. They describe this liberty incident, but they do not mention any slaves shouting liberty, describing only all-white, peaceful street processions. In a town with a large population of free and enslaved blacks, surrounded by counties with majority slave populations, the invisibility should not be simply treated as absence. There has to be some sort of larger explanation. In contrast, when he was explaining events to his superiors in London, the royal governor, Lieutenant Governor Bull, highlighted the role of African Americans. Bull blamed the chaos on an illegitimate gathering of a, quote, giddy-minded crowd, emphasizing that the mob consisted of, quote, disorderly Africans and more disorderly sailors. Often cast together, the actions of slaves and sailors reveals the way in which both race and class discourses intertwine to shape imperial perceptions in London of what was happening in the colonies. Assessing the panic among the Carolina whites for a private correspondent, slave trader and owner Henry Lawrence dismissed the agency of blacks entirely during this liberty incident, writing that, quote, there was little or no cause for all that bustle. Some slaves had merely mimicked their betters in crying out for liberty. While no fan of the Stamp Act protesters, himself would be a target, Henry Lawrence insinuated that royal officials in fact used the possibility of slave insurrection to, quote, stimulate the white men to watchfulness in order to, quote, prevent future and further street protests as a way to kind of create a loyal climate. Despite the clear manipulation of these events and of actions in the street by the sources, the variety of actions taken by slaves on the ground suggests the way in which individuals exercise their will, and how often agency is shaped by local contexts and which shapes these choices. We'll go to another port to kind of see how this story continues. In Newport, Rhode Island, we get an example of one of these great protests, which I'm hoping that you heard some of the other talks in this series describe the funeral processions and burying of liberty. But in Newport, Rhode Island, the newspaper accounts reported that there was a prodigious concourse of mourners that gathered at the Crown Coffee House. Now, these protests for liberty were fantastic. These burials, you can actually see it. So there's an effigy in the foreground of this. If you look in the background, you can see one of these funeral processions occurring. And they would put liberty into the coffin, as you're about to hear, and march them through the street. And usually at the last moment, they discover Liberty's still alive, and they can kind of revive her at the last moment. In only one port have I found they actually put the stamp master into the coffin and buried him, and started putting the dirt on top of him until he cried out. And they were like, "Oh, do you resign?" And then they pulled him out, and then he didn't say it loudly enough, so they put him back in and continued, which sounds really terrifying when you think about it. But in Newport, Rhode Island, they do one of these grand burials or mock funerals of liberty. And the group of people who gathered at the Crown Coffee House to stage this funeral included, according to the newspaper, quote, persons of all ranks, from the highest down to the blacks, who seemed, from a sense of their master's sufferings, to join in. Struck with melancholy, this integrated funeral procession proceeded the length of town to symbolically inter, quote, their dear, beloved, departed friend Liberty. But suddenly, as was often the case, a groan was heard from the coffin, for old freedom was not dead, and thus snatched from the jaws of frozen death, rose towards the sun. So grand was this apotheosis of old liberty that the author lamented in the newspaper. What pen can possibly convey an idea of the jubilant assembly? The biracial concourse that accompanied and joined together then in song shouted the chorus, "Britannia's sons despise slavery and dare to be nobly free." The report, which circulated widely in the British Empire, described a controlled street protest, with blacks cast into the role of servants dutifully following their masters. The account echoed Carolinian Henry Lawrence's description and perception of blacks mindlessly mimicking or echoing liberty. For free and enslaved protesters, however, this imperial disruption offered an opportunity to subvert the intended meanings of this kind of concourse by mourning and loudly crying for liberty, and to try to expand intended outcomes by singing against slavery. On the street, free and enslaved participants demanded acknowledgement of their presence as part and members of this port community. As much as people tried to deny it, they made themselves felt and made their presence known. Colonial protesters and pamphleteers routinely invoked visions of slavery. Crying "no slavery, no stamps," colonists took this message to the street. They also wrote at length decrying their enslavement in pamphlets and newspapers. This was a long recognized political discourse on slavery. It drew from ancient roots and specifically discussed the enslavement in the context of abstract rights that would be guaranteed to a free people by a proper constitution. Evident in these accounts of street protests, there exists a related but distinct discourse on race. Colonists decried slavery with their pens, but they also blackened their faces on the street. White colonists knowingly costumed themselves in sailors' habits, and in choosing to put on blackface during riots, and routinely blamed any occurrence of violence and property destruction on African Americans. The recorders and authors of protests participated in an imperial and particularly active racial discourse. As the protests spread, so too did this debate over the question of crowd actions and the legitimacy of the anti-stamp actions. The spark continues southward to a spot that not enough people get to either visit or talk about in the context of the American Revolution, St. Kitts and Nevis, islands in the West Indies. They were excited, in fact, both the Pennsylvania Gazette and the Connecticut Current, to report with delight and pleasure that the patriotic spark had been found here as well. Newspapers arrived from the island, unstamped, which informed readers in the New England and Boston area that a, quote, patriotic spirit increased among these free people. In fact, the spark of protest lit a grand demonstration in the port town of Basse-Terre, which is the northern of these two islands at St. Kitts and the separate island of Nevis to the south. In Basse-Terre, quote, North American sailors that belonged to sloops and schooners in the road behaved like young lions, guiding the islanders to form a crowd on the 5th of November, 1765, that followed the, quote, true and loyal spirit of the North Americans. The assembly burned and totally destroyed the stamps, then paraded and burned the effigies of several persons, before finally capping the night with an elegant supper, drums beating, French horns playing, and the last toast given was liberty, property, and no stamps. The author of the account summarized the entire spectacle. Quote, you never saw people more spirited than what we were upon that occasion. The patriotic fire burned bright in that port town and inspired a similar protest across the channel in nearby Nevis, including the actual burning of several houses and a royal boat in protest, acts which the newspaper acknowledged perhaps went a, quote, bit too far. But what's interesting about these accounts is that there's also a separate version of these accounts, which is from the perspective of the target, the local stamp distributor William Tuckett, who wrote very differently about the spirit and daring, as one might imagine. Tuckett was greatly surprised by the growing crowd outside of Nolan's Tavern in Basse-Terre, and he hid while a mob assembled, broke open Mr. Hopkins' house, took away the stamps forcibly, and committed them into the flames. In his official report of the incident, Tuckett described the physical abuse he suffered. Quote, I had no sooner mounted my horse, rode into town amongst the mob of sailors, dock workers, and locals, than I was knocked down. Weakened from a recent bout of fever, Tuckett wrote that, quote, I should have certainly been murdered at that time, had not some blacks who know me caught me up and bore me away from the enraged populace. As the port city turned upside down, those free or enslaved African Americans, it's hard to tell from the source which, read the situation, made choices, and took risks to protect a crown official. Writing to his superiors in London, Tuckett presented a scene so chaotic that slaves or free blacks alone remained capable of loyalty, courage, and duty. To avoid being suspended from the gallows, the infirm stamp distributor resigned his office, escaping that night on a boat across the 7-mile channel to Nevis. It's likely that boat that they burned the next day. Tuckett's report echoes the main themes applied by opponents of colonial street protests, whose accounts often highlight the role of sailors in port town crowds to disparage colonial constitutional claims, and blame sailors and African Americans for these feverish scenes. Like a disease spreading throughout these port towns, these accounts cast itinerant sailors as ringleaders and shock troops of the mobs, pulling down houses and intimidating royal officials before moving on to the next port of call. Even in Savannah, Georgia, and of course Georgia is the one port on the mainland that pays willingly the stamp duty, the traditional street festivities that were associated with Pope's Day transformed into political protest, with sailors in particular playing a central role. On November 5th, 1765, accompanied by, quote, great guns, which actually oftentimes accompany these protests to kind of draw the crowd together, across the harbor in celebration, a number of sailors assembled to parade through the streets. One of the sailors was dressed up, disguised to represent the stamp master, and he was hoisted upon a scaffold supported by 6 others and decorated with a paper in his hand and a rope fastened under his arms and around his neck. As they moved throughout the port city, the parade stopped, quote, at certain stages where this pretended stamp master was obliged with several severe blows with a cudgel to call out in a pitiful tone, "No stamps, no riot act." The quote from the paper continued, "Having thus sufficiently exposed him to the view of the inhabitants, he was further abused with every indignity they could think of, until the sailors conducted their actor playing the stamp master to McHenry's tavern. There they let him hang in the gallows for quite a little while, and afterwards cut him down, and in the presence of the crowd of spectators, who were highly diverted by the humor of the tars." Despite the central role that Jack Tar sailors play in the large crowd that gathered to watch and participate in this roaming street theater, the author noted, drawing a contrast with the stories that were coming out of this town of Boston of riotous assemblies, that, quote, private as well as public property had remained unmolested and no outrages had been committed. Now, on one hand, the sailors' involvement in these kinds of street actions appears fairly unsurprising. In both contemporary accounts and historical writing, sailors are notorious for their involvement in mobs. What makes these accounts fascinating, however, is not assuming that sailors simply tap into some deep, subconscious, latent reserve of protest, but rather considering these sailors and mariners as historical actors and individuals who weighed their options, considered aspects of risk and reward, and made a clear set of choices, and also to consider their role interacting with this port community. This account in Savannah, for example, sailors refashioned traditional religious scene against the Pope into a political argument, which they performed at multiple spots throughout the town to instruct, inform, and convince watching audiences. This scene borrowed broadly from older English traditions, but also echoed novel elements of street protests that were on display in other cities, including the use of gallows, a set of visual cues like the paper to distinguish the stamp officials, and the repeated phrases of protest, "No stamps, no liberty." The designers and actors in the scene also displayed a unique set of choices and decisions. They opted for a live actor rather than a straw-stuffed effigy. They're the only town to do this. And these humorous Jack Tars tapped into their reputation for silly, childlike behavior in Savannah among a people who willingly paid the stamp tax in order to make a fairly detailed political statement protesting the imperial reform measures. At the heart of the challenge of analyzing groups such as the ones described in Savannah and the actions of sailors in these scenes is the broad stroke with which contemporary sources paint sailors. You can do the same thing with African Americans. It's very hard to tell free or enslaved. But accounts of printed protests in newspapers usually number under about 300 words, and they typically describe sailors in an indiscriminate manner. They include blue water jack tars, coastal mariners, green water pilots, and dockside laborers under this single label, making it difficult to consider individual motivations and actions. Royal officials, similarly, make little effort to parse the distinctions in unruly crowds, dismantling buildings and forcing their resignations, preferring instead to try to unmask the steerers and the inciters of the people, blaming in their reports back to London well-known printers, political radicals, seditious lawyers, and in Philadelphia, the Presbyterians very oddly get blamed. Clearly, the sailors in the Savannah display possessed access to the materials necessary to construct such a sizable mobile gallows. They possessed knowledge of local Pope's Day practices and enough of an understanding of, or at least sensitivity to local political attitudes, not to incite or solicit more crowd participation by transforming this effigy scene into a bonfire or into a more participatory theater. Each of these elements suggests that this is in fact not a group of itinerant jack tars, but there was a significant participation of individuals familiar with Savannah. Considering the impulses and strategies of protest gives us ways in which to access the connection points that existed between the seafaring sailors and these dockside communities. Decades of impressment riots powerfully informed this anti-stamp street action, from the targeted use of violence and of property associated with the perpetrator, the use of resonant symbols, the physical occupation of streets and town greens and government buildings as sites to stage open dissent. Impressment riots were community actions in the British Empire, involving not just sailors, but often their wives and family in a broad cross-section of seaside communities, with the most notorious protests, such as those in Boston, lasting for days, like the Knowles riots. The new series of reforms and trade regulations which followed the end of the 7 Years' War affected many of the shared economic interests and social connections between sailors and coastal communities. For example, the long-standing tradition of allowing sailors to engage in what were called economic adventures, or buying small parts of cargo space and selling goods and foodstuffs in informal markets and port towns, now appeared with the customs reforms closer to illicit smuggling, threatening both the buyer and seller with the prosecution in distant admiralty courts. Seafaring traders injected capital at taverns, tippling houses, and the inns of port towns, but they also engaged in a series of speculative trade arrangements, and many even planned for where to establish permanent trade following their retirement from the sea. Near the seaboard as well, ocean-going vessels regularly encountered smaller coastal crafts, creating an important conduit of news, rumor, and information. Newspapers and ports acknowledged this phenomenon, often beginning the news with the name of the captain or the ship who first provided the story to the paper. These informal networks strengthened at a moment of crisis, when ship captains began to fret about becoming trapped in a harbor that had closed, or receiving a fine or worse for going into a harbor that was paying the duty. Seeking out places to sell their cargoes and fulfill their orders, ships at sea readily began to exchange information. These informal economic and social networks, which were often manned by sailors, captains, and mariners, proved critical for the anti-stamp protest strategy. In Virginia, for example, the last of our case studies tonight, the imminent arrival of both the stamp official, George Mercer, and the stamp paper raised concern throughout the coastal peninsula to plan an appropriate response. The anti-stamp partisans relied upon information supplied by the sailors of the location of the ships, the timing of the arrival, and the possibility of resistance. As Mercer's ship rounded Norfolk, tacked past Newport News, and continued up the James River, prior intelligence gathered by sailors rallied and informed a growing crowd in Williamsburg of the vessel's detested cargo. According to the newspaper, the response was planned well in advance and placed into motion hours before Mercer's arrival in Williamsburg, when, quote, the gentlemen of the place invited him to a ball that night, treated him with the utmost politeness, but after it was all over, they informed him his bags were placed on another ship that would be bound back to London the next morning. The stamp distributor was informed, quote, and advised to take passage in her without delay, as his life would be in danger. Thus, turned around, Mercer sailed away and was instructed to inform his superiors of the peaceful, yet hardy resistance of Virginians against the offending legislation. Sailors not only played a central role, such as in Savannah and Virginia in the protests of the Stamp Act crisis, but as icons, they also served a strategic purpose of both supporters and opponents of colonial protests. For example, on the street, colonists used the perception and fears of sailor and slave violence as tools to accomplish their own goals. Wealthy South Carolina merchant Henry Lawrence, among many others, was awakened by a violent thumping and, quote, confused roar of liberty, liberty, and stamped paper outside his house. He ran to his front door to assure the crowd that he possessed no stamps. Despite the shrieking of his wife, a poor sick woman far gone with child, meaning pregnant, and the brace of pistols that Lawrence brandished, the crowd was unsatisfied with his response, and they forced their way into his home. With cutlasses drawn against his chest, Lawrence described looking closely at the assembly, attempting to penetrate what he described as their costumes of soot, sailors' habits, and slouch hats, wherein he recognized 9 of his gentry acquaintances among the mist. In port after port, costuming themselves such, with trousers and jackets as sailors, colonists similarly attacked suspected opponents and pulled down homes. Their costuming served a dual purpose. The costume motley crew struck fear into its targets and obscured their own identity, effectively protecting participants from recognition and prosecution. For patriots during the Stamp Act crisis, such imperial associations of sailors with crime and disorderly behavior made jack tars as caricatures particularly useful scapegoats for colonists. When a community preferred not to accept responsibility or punishment for its extra-legal actions, it could simply blame sailors who would then sail along to the next port. Similarly, royal officials used the specter of sailor and slave upheaval to justify their actions and rally communities to restore order, and even to illegally reopen the port without stamped paper. However, there was a general awareness of a growing sense of American disorder. Colonial patriots increasingly sought limited forms of resistance and strategies, like an economic one of non-importation or boycott associations, which would remove protests from the street and involve only permanent, settled members of a community associated with property and trade. Despite the reports of peaceful symbolic protests across the British Empire, the perception of, as the Assembly of Barbados put it, a violent spirit raised in the North American colonies endured. Disinclined to engage on the street for fear of the actions of black slaves and itinerant sailors, white colonists began to search for alternative strategies to relocate dissent, and settled upon, as John Dickinson wrote, a, quote, justifiable opposition which can be made without breaking the laws or disturbing the public peace. A novel strategy began to emerge by the end of this time period of economic protests, of non-importation and boycotts, which it was hoped would incite riots in London, on the streets of London, rather than on the streets of these colonial port towns. The presence of the motley crew of jack tars and black slaves served, as past historians have noted, as a disincentive to protest. But moreover, it also was influential in emerging economic strategies of imperial dissent as well. The dockside community continued to play a critical role in the protest movements leading to independence. However, the disorderly caricature of the itinerant jack tar was retired to be accessed only during moments of particular tumult and disorder. That's why you start to see not the sailor, but rather the American Indian become the symbol of the American cause. Even as print sources began to edit and started to sort local actions and audiences, sailors considered and acted upon their own constitutional claims as fellow British subjects. And similarly, freed and enslaved African Americans laid claim to their own rights and freedoms. The challenge for us as historians and people interested in the Revolution is to consider how to meaningfully weave the entire port community together to understand this moment, and in particular sailors and African Americans as part of these communities and part of the American Revolutionary experience, highlighting how from the very first moments of this imperial crisis, communities grappled with this question of political rights and inclusion, of who would get to become not just subjects but also citizens, and who belonged in the body politic. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
So I sort of have a really simple question, which is where does the term Jack Tar really originate?
That is a great question. I believe, and this is where I would have to rely on my colleagues who also study the British Empire, it's a much older term, and it comes from the association of tar and naval stores and the building of boats, but also the repairing of them and the using of tar. But I believe it actually predates this by at least a century, would be my guess. I think it's much older. It's in common parlance during this time.
Would it be considered derogatory or just descriptive?
It is often derogatory in these contexts because they're described as bow-leg, baggy-trousered. Jesse Limish has a very good piece that I would recommend. I think it's one of the top articles cited from the William and Mary Quarterly on Jack Tars and talking about them in the streets during this time. It is, oh my goodness, it's going to escape me right now. It's Jack Tar in the Streets, I believe, right? Okay, Jack Tar in the Streets. Jack Tar in the Streets, William and Mary Quarterly article. I'd highly recommend.
Write it down.
Even if I disagree with some parts of it, but I highly recommend it.
I've got, I think, a more complicated question.
Okay.
I'm intrigued by some interwoven relationships here. You've got the British government, the East India Company, the slave trade. You've got sailors that are interested only in local coastal commerce, and sailors that are undoubtedly crewing slave ships and East India ships. And you've got slaves that are the product of this enterprise, and you've got a British government that's trying to recoup losses that it claims it suffered in the 7 Years' War and impacting our private commerce. And I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on, the fact that it's these two populations that are the most prominent in these protests in the early days, and all of these interwoven relationships that comes down more to private commerce, actually, than the British government itself. And it would be these two populations who might be the most aware of that, but have the least power to comment on it, except through these protests.
I agree entirely. There are kind of a couple elements of that I see come up regularly. One is that oftentimes people treat these two groups as entirely outside of politics, and I think you're right to say that they are very much not only cognizant of, but very much tied into imperial politics and imperial economics, which are themselves quite interrelated issues. The other thing is that these are two groups that are often cast as working together. Marcus Rediger and other historians' work oftentimes looks at these types of sources and looks at sailors and slaves as kind of hand in hand in many ways, rising up against the forces of capitalism. From my study and my archival work, I find that these two groups sometimes work together, but oftentimes are quite separate and distinct, and more often than not, in fact, find themselves. And in some ways, they're actually a more complex group. You described the variety of things that sailors are doing. There are also sailors who are members of the Royal Navy who are protecting these stamped papers, who are serving to actually stop these protests. And the real challenge in some respects is the fact that we have to start to understand how do these various groups of mariners work together, and at what point, because there's been so much work on ocean-going sailors, and then a separate set of work that kind of covers these port communities. Where do we get those intersections, and how can we start to talk and write meaningfully about that? And that's part of what my work tries to do. It's complicated, certainly, and I think that we actually have to understand that these port communities are very complicated places of study, and embracing that is part of what makes the revolution so interesting in a lot of ways. I hope that answers at least some parts of your question, to suggest yes. In fact, it's very imperial and much more difficult.
I just wanted to say thank you for incorporating the African American experience. In college, I took an American Revolution class, and the full semester, 4 months, and that wasn't included. I just want to say thank you.
No, you're welcome. In Virginia, of course, we talk a lot about Lord Dunmore's proclamation, because you might not know this, but Virginians are very proud of their moments in the Revolution. And so we talk a lot about Lord Dunmore, but this I see as an earlier version in many ways of those kind of issues that Sylvia Frey and others describe. Thank you very much.
This transmission of ideas from city to countryside helped to transform the revolution from a waterfront cause to a countryside cause, and ultimately an intercolonial cause.